Jai Hind to everybody who is attending this lovely event on 14th of April, 2022. As always, we will travel back in time today. We'll travel as far back as 1857. September 18, 1857. Friday, the city of Delhi, under siege for 4 months by the Firangi army. And the Sipahis of Indian origin who worked for the British Indian Army and the East India Company are defending the fort and the city. It's a very, very difficult battle. The British Indian Army is very well trained, and the Sipahis are equally brave. Not an inch is given despite the best efforts of the British guns, British bombs. The distance between Kashmiri Gate and Red Fort is a mere mile, but it's taking days to get to the Red Fort. Suddenly, the sky started going dark in the middle of the day. At about noon, a partial sun eclipse happened over the city of Delhi. And then, for a full 5 minutes, the sun was covered by the moon, and Delhi plunged into darkness in the middle of an afternoon. For the Sipahis who were fighting the first war of independence, this was an ominous sign. They had joined battle with the belief that after 100 years of the Battle of Plassey, the East India Company and the Firangis will be destroyed and their war will end. India would be free. The solar eclipse perplexed the soldiers of the British Indian Army also. For 3 hours, Delhi was in partial darkness. It was a sign of an end of the British East India Company as well as the Mughal Sultanate led by Bahadur Shah Zafar at that time. Exactly 2 days later, on 20th September, the Red Fort fell. A day later, Bahadur Shah Zafar was arrested. His sons were killed. Delhi was devastated. The 3 princes who were killed by Major Hodgson mercilessly, before dying, one of them said, "If the Hindus and the Muslims stay together, no foreign power can ever invade us." There is a monument which is built exactly where 3 princes were murdered. It's called Khuni Darwaza in Delhi. The Ghadar of 1857 had spread all over India. It would become the inspiration for the Indian revolutionaries and freedom fighters over the next 90 years. The Rani of Jhansi fought her last battle during the Ghadar of 1857. On the morning of 21st September, at dawn, 101 guns boomed from the walls of the Red Fort. And with the booming of each gun, a message was sent across India. From now onwards, you are going to be ruled by Hukumat Britannia out of London. And you are going to be part of the British Empire. We control your present and your future. The Union Jack went up on Red Fort on that day. The story of 1857 has been written by many, many historians. But it was Veer Savarkar, studying in London at the India House, 50 years after the events of 1857, who understood what it really meant. And he brought out a book called The First War of Indian Independence. That was the first time what the British called the mutiny was seen as a war of independence. And it didn't stop here. Though Savarkar was jailed and sent to the Andamans to serve a term in the cellular jail, his compatriot, Lala Hardayal, set up the Ghadar Party during the First World War and demanded complete freedom from the British Empire. This was a unique event. It was much before anybody else, any freedom fighter in India, any freedom movement in India that was so well organized, so global, in fact, intercontinental, that wanted to wage a war with the British in India. But the Germans lost the First World War, and the Ghadar movement was destroyed systematically by the British intelligence agency. The Indo-German trial in San Francisco, and the Lahore conspiracy case, and the Delhi conspiracy case brought the Ghadar movement to an end. But one event during the Ghadar movement captured the minds of the Indian revolutionists. On 23rd December 1912, as the Viceroy of England, Lord Hardinge, entered Delhi, the whole city had come to see him. There were 50 elephants in the procession. The objective was to get off of the train at the Delhi railway station, take the procession through Chandni Chowk, and go up to Red Fort to once again unfurl the Union Jack. Just as the elephants procession started moving towards the Red Fort, a huge sound, a loud sound was heard. It was actually so loud, it was heard 6 miles away. It was the sound of a bomb. Somebody had attempted to kill the Viceroy on the day of his arrival in Delhi. It was a reminder that this was the city that had fought the First World War, First War of Indian Independence in 1857. The British intelligence set out all its agents all over the world to find out who threw the bomb. But it was too late. The man believed to have thrown the bomb was Rashbihari Bose, and he had escaped. Nobody could ever catch him. He went as far as Japan and lived in Tokyo. There were very few Indians living in Tokyo at that time, less than 100. Most of the Indians living in Japan, actually just about 250 Indians, they were living in Kobe, which was a sort of a trading place for Indians. So it would have been very easy to catch an Indian if the British really wanted in Japan. But Rashbihari Bose was supported by the Japanese. He could never be arrested. After the First World War, the Indian freedom movement took a unique turn. a man destined to liberate the country from British Empire entered the scene. And it was a very dramatic entry. Subhas Chandra Bose was a very bright, young, intelligent Indian. He had made it to the Cambridge University to study. And while studying, he was, like all Indians at that time, looking at joining the Indian civil service. It's very difficult to explain to people what the Indian civil service would entail for a young Indian. But all I can tell you to all the young listeners of your university today, it's like getting the job of a CEO in a company like Microsoft or Twitter at a very young age. It was the best job on earth. It was possibly the life of royalty, and you had immense power. You could make huge contributions. Subhas Chandra Bose appeared in that exam. He had a history of being a bit of a radical and an anti-British Empire person. That came through in the interview. Though he had done extremely well in the written exam, the British interviewers were not very happy with him. Ideally, if everything had remained normal, he would have topped the exam. But they positioned him, they dropped him to the position of 4. He was 4th in the list. At that stage, he had joined the heaven-born service. He had qualified for it, but he did not want to join. The nationalist in him wanted to do something much bigger than what was possible within the confines of the Indian civil service. Dramatically, Subhas Chandra Bose resigned from the Indian civil service, becoming the first Indian and the only Indian to have ever done that. From that moment onwards, this man was the most interesting man in the freedom struggle of India. He was stuff legends are made of. He came to India and became a participant in the Indian National Congress enterprise. He had differences with the Congress party. He did not understand how non-violence over a period of time, along with civil disobedience, would appeal to an invader who completely controlled the country with its military might. He could not see non-violence and civil disobedience ever succeeding. He was a student of history. He had seen all the revolutionary movements around the world and read about them. He always felt the way to get India its freedom would be fighting a war. Obviously, there were no takers within the Congress party because it was dominated by Mahatma Gandhi. Yet Netaji became the general secretary of the party, became a mayor of Calcutta at that time, Kolkata now. Dramatically, there were revolutionaries, secret societies in India. Some of them were inspired by the Gadar movement, and some of them were inspired by Aurobindo Ghosh's movement in Bengal. There were other revolutionaries inspired by Veer Savarkar out of Maharashtra. There were even more revolutionaries outside India who wanted and favored Netaji's viewpoint and ideology for freeing the country. 3 young men were hanged by the British Empire, and one of them was Bhagat Singh. The story of Bhagat Singh would require another event. But I must tell you what happened in England when Bhagat Singh was hanged by the British. The British Parliament met. And the first question was asked: what has Bose said after the hanging of Bhagat Singh? The British Empire had already marked Subhas Chandra Bose as a person who would create potentially the greatest trouble for them. And Netaji, at that time, when Bhagat Singh was hanged in India, had said, "You kill one Bhagat Singh, thousands will be born." He was right. By 1938, the world had changed. Congress party also wanted to give Netaji a chance to lead the party. There were many people in the party who had complete dislike for him. Some of them thought that his participation in the Congress party would lead to the entire movement being transformed as a violent revolutionary movement. Others had reservations because they thought Netaji, being a bit of a leftist, would create problems with the financiers of the party. Yet, with great restraint and difficulty, he was appointed the president of the party. Subhas Chandra Bose became the youngest president the Congress party ever had. And he brought to the party his brilliance, his global exposure, his ability to see, foresee, his ability to build an organization that would make India a global power. Among the notable things he did during that short period of being the president of the Congress party was the Planning Commission to start working towards an era when India would be free and we would build a country from scratch. By 1938, the British Empire was basically funded by the Indian economy. A recent economic survey has informed us that almost $45 trillion worth of wealth was transferred from India by 1938 by the British rulers. And this does not include the countless jewels, the statues, and the use of the Indians in the military enterprises of the British during First World War and numerous other exercises. After serving for 1 year as president of the Congress party, Subhas Chandra Bose wanted another term because his job was not yet finished. And he had an agenda which was fairly large. He was dissuaded from taking that step. He reasoned with the leadership of the party, specifically Mahatma Gandhi, that there have been others who have had 2 subsequent terms. They have been presidents who have run the Congress party for more than even 3-4 times. So I should at least be given 1 more year. Subhas Chandra Bose was a democratic person. He said, let's have an election. There was nobody who would want to fight an election against him. In the winter of 1939, Subhas Chandra Bose was the most popular man in the country. I have seen pictures of him arriving in Bombay, taken by a German camera person who was shooting Indian films at that time. And other leaders are present at the station to receive him. But the crowds from Victoria Terminus across the city are for Netaji. People had waited for hours and hours to catch a glimpse of him. When he came to Delhi after being elected as president of the Congress party, the whole of Chandni Chowk came out to see. 5'10", handsome man, known for sacrificing a job at the Indian civil service. He had no match. In the winter of 1939, Mahatma Gandhi asked some of his close disciples to fight the election against Netaji. Having found nobody equal to the election, to fight the election, he turned to Sitaramaiah and told him, basically ordered him to go out and fight. Mahatma Gandhi also said, Sitaramaiah's loss would be my loss, so please vote for him. An election took place. For the first time in the history of the Congress party, for the president of the party. And the winner was Netaji Subhas Chandra Bose. At that moment, the entire Congress leadership revolted. Even though Netaji had been elected in a fair election, even though he was the president of the party, the working committee of the Congress party resigned en masse. And that included somebody he had always considered his friend, Jawaharlal Nehru. Isolated, Netaji rose like a statesman. And he declared, how can I run the Congress party if I don't have the support of the greatest man of India, Mahatma Gandhi? He resigned and walked away from the presidency. The only person who have ever done that. September 1939, the world once again went to war. This time it was the Nazis versus the British Empire. Paris was invaded. London was bombed ceaselessly. And India was pushed into the war without consulting anybody. Indian soldiers were drafted and sent all over the world to fight the Nazis and the Axis powers. Netaji at that time was still active and running forward bloc, his own party. His revolutionary ideas and events that he supported and his actions eventually took him once again in the jails of the British Empire. And while he was in jail, he kept on hearing about the events in Europe, and they greatly disturbed him. For he knew he would have to sit out while the world was at war. And this was the most important moment for him because Britain, for once, was on the back foot. And Hukumat Britannia couldn't have done much. It was the moment to strike. Netaji Subhas Chandra Bose was released briefly and put under house arrest because he was not well. But this was a plan. See the brilliance of the person. He was outthinking everybody. British intelligence is a global enterprise. It destroyed the Ghadar party. It destroyed the lives of individuals who were considered revolutionary leaders. It was not an easy enemy to have. Netaji was in his house in Kolkata on 17th of January 1941. And that night, he secretly escaped. Imagine a man as popular as a film star, traveling incognito, in a train across the country from east of India to Delhi, changing the train, getting on another train, reaching Peshawar without being discovered. While he was in Peshawar, he was still on Indian territory and still under the control, possibly, of the British secret agents. So he had to run off and cross the border and reach Afghanistan. Here is a man in his early 40s, in the winter of 1941, crossing the most difficult terrain in the world. Even now, it is extremely difficult to cross from Peshawar to Kabul. Netaji traveled on foot, traveled by car, traveled by trucks. And he made it to Jalalabad. From Jalalabad to Kabul. His mission was to take him and reach somehow Europe, possibly Berlin. Kabul was not an easy place. It was filled with spies. Netaji had to remain underground. He sought help from various ambassadors. They refused to recognize him. He had grown a beard. He looked different. They thought he was an imposter. The German mission warned him that there are spies looking for you. No help came forward. The Russian mission did not even allow him to have a meeting. Times were very desperate. News had reached London that Netaji has not gone to Japan. Believe me, I'm Subhas Chandra Bose, the Consul General, sitting across the desk, told Netaji, you don't need to convince me. Senor Bose, you don't remember when you came to meet the Il Duce in Roma? I was the foreign ministry official who showed you the city. I was in charge of you. We will do whatever it takes to get you to Europe and to Berlin. Once again, Netaji was on the move. He traveled the distance from Kabul to Samarkand. Again, treacherous roads, difficult terrain. He traveled with the German intelligence on an Italian passport. He made it to Moscow in a train. And from Moscow, he was secretly brought into Europe to Berlin. Now, Berlin was in the middle of an unwinnable war with the rest of the world. Their only partner was Italy at that time, and some support from various other quarters. But Hitler was determined to rule the planet, and he was doing whatever it took. The Nazis had great respect for the British Empire and almost no respect for the Indian freedom movement. They did not take Mahatma Gandhi seriously. For them, Netaji was just another guy. He was an Indian living in Berlin, in hotels actually, seeking meetings with the diplomatic corps of the Third Reich. Extremely difficult time. No recognition of who this man was. Eventually, he got to meet people who were important. The senior leadership of the Nazis recognized in Netaji a man who was very unusual and capable of getting India its freedom. One of them actually went on record to say his escape from India to Berlin should be made into an international movie. Some support came forward. In Berlin, Netaji set up the Free India center with the help of Indians who were living in Europe. He set up the Azad Hind radio. And he also tried to set up a small army from the prisoners of war who had been captured during the Second World War by the Germans. My friend Surya Bose is here, and he has told me some very interesting things about that period in Germany that had impacted India for years. The three things that stand out. One was the national anthem that we sing in India today was first sung in that period in Germany, in Hamburg. The national slogan that unites India, even now, Jai Hind, was actually invented in Germany during that period. And Netaji became Netaji in Germany. Before that, he was called Subhash Babu, Mr. Bose, Sir, everything else. But the word Netaji came about in that period. While Netaji was in Germany and struggling to get an army going in Berlin, the Indian freedom movement took a very unusual turn. In August 1942, Mahatma Gandhi and the Congress Party announced the Quit India movement. The assumption was that some of the leaders of the Congress Party would go on hunger strike and the British would quickly leave. Unfortunately, none of that happened. All that happened was that the jails were filled with thousands and thousands of Indians and members of the Congress Party. In fact, the entire leadership of the Congress Party at that time was jailed. They were not jailed to cellular jail as the revolutionaries usually were. They were jailed in regular jails within the country, meant for political prisoners who were treated a little differently from the criminals who were also jailed at the same time. For the Indians, it was a shock. There was nobody they could hear or see. The newspapers were censored. Suddenly, the sales of the shortwave radios started going up in the country. The British intelligence noted that people were coming to radio sellers and asking for specific radio sets so that they could hear German frequencies. The reason was simple. Netaji was appearing in Azad in the radio. And at a time when the nation needed him the most, he was telling India, don't worry, we will be free. I'm working at it. His voice, his way of speaking, captivated the country. Though his radio station was banned by the British, it reached the deepest corners of the country. And in that time of great trouble, the nation was united and expected one day will come when Netaji will bring us freedom. The Japanese attacked the Pearl Harbor and the war expanded to the Pacific region. In 1942, they had reached Singapore on 14th of February, and subsequently, they took over Burma and Rangoon. The Japanese land forces and air force were standing on the border of India. In fact, they actually invaded Andaman and Nicobar territory of the British Indian Empire. With so much happening and in Asia, and the Indian National Army being formed by Rashbihari Bose, Netaji realized he was in the wrong geography. His meetings with the Nazi leadership did not amount to much. Now he needed a ticket to reach Tokyo. We are talking about Second World War, a very extremely difficult time for international travel. Ships were regularly torpedoed. Planes were shot out of the skies. The land routes were filled with tanks and moving armaments. This was not a time when you did intercontinental travel. Netaji had one final meeting with the senior most leader of the Nazi party, and that meeting went downhill. The person who took him for that meeting has given an interview that is kept in the National War Museum in London. That gentleman who escorted Netaji for that meeting and brought him back to Berlin has written and said, "Here was a man who was traveling in a plane with me for this very important meeting. The plane had to fly low to avoid the radar. It was a very bumpy flight. But he sat there like a Buddha. And once the meeting ended, not in his favor, he traveled back exactly in the same form." Such was Netaji. The German Navy admirals approached Netaji and they told him, "It is possible that we can take a submarine, a U-boat, from Germany, travel through the North Sea, Atlantic, down the coast of Africa, and somewhere near Madagascar, rendezvous with the Japanese submarine and get you to East Asia. It is possible, theoretically. It has never been done before. The reason it has never been done before is simple. There is a 97% chance that this submarine journey will be a failure and will lead to death and destruction." Netaji smiled and told the admirals of the German Navy, "Even if there's a 1% chance of me being able to do this, I will do it." Now, here is a man who has never been on a submarine. He is not a military person by training. He is not a naval person. He joins and gets on a submarine out of Kiel. He knew this was going to be a very difficult and extremely dangerous thing to do. So before leaving Germany, he wrote a letter to his brother informing him that he had married while he was in Europe, and his wife was Emily, and his daughter was Anita. And he left that letter with Emily. Middle of the night, he got onto a boat that took him to a submarine. For the next 3 months, Netaji was in the most dangerous territory on planet Earth, the oceans, Atlantic and Indian Ocean. Continuously bombed by the Allied bombers. Depth charges after depth charges. Every inch, every nautical mile was bombed. The submarine, the U-boat actually, made it with great difficulty to Madagascar. But the journey was not over. The rendezvous with the Japanese submarine had to happen. The Japanese submarine had never attempted such a thing. This was the first time in the history of the planet such a journey was taking place. The water near Madagascar was very rough. For 3 days, the Japanese captain and the German captain tried to coordinate this transfer. It was impossible. The waves were just too rough. They were huge waves, 30 to 60 feet high. There was the danger of Allied bombers arriving and bombing both the submarines. The German captain asked Netaji, we have come this far, now we have to turn back and go back to Germany, Herr Bose. It's going to be impossible. Netaji had lived almost 2 months in that submarine by now. Over 2 months. There was still 3 weeks of journey left if he had to get to Japan. Very difficult and extremely challenging and tiring journey. Netaji told the captain, I have come this far not to return, but to go forward. I will not rest till my country is free. Get me on the Japanese submarine. The German Navy has actually filmed the transfer between the Japanese and the German submarines. It's an amazing film. You can see how difficult it was. And there are sharks in the water with the Japanese and the German naval men are shooting at. Netaji made it to the Japanese submarine. He had traveled incognito from his home in Kolkata through Peshawar, Kabul, Berlin, on land. And now from Germany, he reached Japan on the sea route. All for India, for India's freedom. No one in the history of our civilization has done this. The Indian freedom movement is made up of this man's struggle and story. Everything else that we hear and read does not match the contribution of Subhas Chandra Bose. Japan was on the losing side of the Second World War by the time Netaji reached Tokyo. They had almost no respect for Indians. They thought the Indians speak a foreign language. It's a civilization that is destined to be ruled by foreigners. Netaji was kept in the best hotel in Tokyo, the Imperial Palace, but given no appointments by the government. After 6 weeks of staying in Tokyo, he finally got to meet Prime Minister Togo. Netaji had worked very hard for that meeting. He entered that meeting and immediately impressed Togo. A much taller and a handsome person standing across the room from Togo. And Togo was hearing for the first time a man speaking about the victory of Japan in the Second World War and the strategies to be used to free India during that war. A 15-minute meeting continued for almost 3 hours. It led to a meeting of the cabinet. That led to the meeting of Netaji speaking with the military, naval, and air force chiefs. Everybody decided that Netaji has to address the Japanese parliament. They had never met an Indian like him. All this while, Netaji was working towards building an army. And on 4th of July, 1943, with Tojo standing next to him, Netaji, in the Maidan in Singapore, announced the formation of the Indian National Army. He also spoke at the Cathay cinema house in front of a group of Indians, where Rashbihari Bose, the man from the Gadar movement, handed over the baton to Netaji to take the war to its final stage and lead India to freedom. Some of these speeches have been recorded. They should be played in every single school and college in India. We Indians must hear the voice of Netaji. At Cathay Cinema, Netaji said, he used to speak in Hindustani. He was fluent in Hindustani like no other leader. Captivating speaker. His choice of words was such that it would bring people to tears. At the Cathay Cinema, he said, हम जिएंगे हम मरेंगे ये बात नहीं है, असल बात यह है, अहम बात यह है, हिंदुस्तान आजाद होगा. The entire hall cheered. He gave the Indian National Army a new direction. Delhi chalo. The Chalo Delhi Nara, the slogan, came from 1857. When the Sipahis of the British Indian Army revolted in Meerut and headed towards Delhi. Netaji further created a mission for the Indians in Southeast Asia and told them, we will go to Delhi and our flag will be hoisted on the Red Fort while the Indian National Army does its parade across the road in front of the Red Fort. India will be free. It's a matter of time. During the course of this, he set up an army of 60,000 people. The Azad Hind Fauj, with the Azad Regiment, a Gandhi Regiment, a Nehru Regiment, even a Bahadur Regiment and a Subhas Regiment. The most important thing he did was set up the Rani Jhansi Regiment. The Japanese had never ever seen women warriors. They were not at all keen that women join the army or the military services. But Netaji put together a band of women warriors, trained them in combat. One such woman warrior I have met recently. I've met many, but one is still around. The 94-year-old Lieutenant Asha Sahai, living in Bangalore. An inspiration for India. She fought in the Second World War with Netaji. Netaji inspired them with songs. Kadam kadam badhaye ja, khushi ke geet gaye ja. And then he gave us a slogan which inspires us even now, 75 years after independence. Tum mujhe khoon do, main tumhe azadi dunga. India could not be India without such greatness. On 14th April 1944, Colonel Shaukat Ali Malik, in the middle of the war near Kohima, facing bullets, crossed the Indian border and planted the flag of Azad Hind Fauj in Morang. Our nation has paid too much heed to the city of Porbandar. A more important city in this country, a more important town in this country is Morang, near Kohima. The Azad Hind Museum, the Netaji Museum over there is very dilapidated. This was the place where the first flag of Azad Hind Fauj was placed and hoisted. on Indian territory. Hindus, Sikhs, Christians, and Muslims in the Azad Hind Fauj. The events of the Second World War are well known. The battles of Kohima and Imphal were the most difficult battles fought in the eastern sector. Eventually, the Azad Hind Fauj retreated from Rangoon, from Bangkok. They also lost at Mount Popa. But the third and the final war for independence did not end there. After Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the Japanese surrender, Netaji said, "The roads to Delhi are many and Delhi remains our goal." His life remains adrift in the fog of time right now from that moment onwards. The Indian National Army, Azad Hind Fauj, reached Delhi, not as victors, but as prisoners of war. They were housed in the Red Fort, exactly the same location where the first war was fought. Exactly the same location where the Union Jack was flying. And exactly the same location where Netaji wanted his army, the Azad Hind Fauj and the Indian National Army, to stage its march past. The British thought they had to make an example of the Indians in the Azad Hind Fauj. While Nuremberg trials were happening in Europe, they set up the INA trials at the Red Fort. And they chose 3 men from the Azad Hind Fauj: Captain Prem Sehgal, Captain Shahnawaz Khan, and Lieutenant Gurbaksh Singh Dhillon. 3 men representing 3 important faiths of India. For the first time, the British saw something they had never witnessed before. The Congress party and its adversary, the Muslim League, were on the same side of the fence as far as the INA was concerned. The whole country was united in wanting the freedom of the INA people arrested by the British Indian Army. Jawaharlal Nehru has gone on record to say, wherever he went, even in the deepest corners of the country, people approached him and said, "These men are patriots. They are not traitors. They must be freed." The Congress party had lawyers who had opposed Netaji. They were totally opposing his re-election as president for the second time. One of them was Bhulabhai Desai. But seeing the patriotism of the man, his capability, extraordinary courage, and his capability in putting together an army in those circumstances, he became the defender of the INA trial and came forward as the defense counsel. He was supported by the top league of Indian lawyers, Sir Tegh Bahadur Sapru, Kharju, a battery of 12 top eminent legal brains got together, worked out of Asif Ali's office in Daryaganj. They invited Japanese witnesses. Till now, India did not know what Azad Hind Fauj was because everything was censored. The news of Netaji was specially blacked out. The British didn't want the country to know what happened. But the INA trial changed that. With each witness appearing in the court, with each statement, the newspapers were filled with the information. There were protests held all over the country. The nation wanted these 3 men to be freed under any circumstances. लाल किले के दरवाजे तोड़ दो, शाहनवाज, सैगल और ढिल्लन को छोड़ दो. That was the slogan. But the match was fixed. The outcome of the trial was already predetermined. Finally, the British cashiered the three men and transported them for life, finding them guilty on all accounts. The order that had to be signed at the conclusion of these trials at the Red Fort was placed before the Commander-in-Chief of the Indian Army, General Claude Auchinleck. On the 1st of January 1946. By now, the British intelligence had informed him of the possibility of a nationwide revolt in case he signed that document. The Indians within the British Indian Army had told him nobody would take an order if these three men were affected in any manner by the British. There were further reports that not a single British officer would go back alive. There would be mutinies across the country in case these three men were cashiered and hanged. Under those very unusual circumstances, Claude Auchinleck, who spoke Indian languages, knew the Indian Army, and worked with the soldiers, took a very wise decision. He let the three men go scot-free. They were let out of the Red Fort and allowed to go wherever they wanted. Within days, the news of the freedom of these three men went all across the world. That was the moment. The mightiest empire the world had ever seen. The British Empire, Hukumat Britannia, lost to one man, Netaji Subhas Chandra Bose. India became free. The British Indian Army was filled with compatriots and relatives of the men and soldiers of the Azad Hind Fauj. They were the same people. Not being able to govern its territory using the military might created a problem for the British Empire. They had to pack their bags and leave as soon as possible. There was a naval mutiny subsequently in February 1946. There were mutinies in Jabalpur. The slogan that united the country at that moment was Jai Hind. The picture that was put up by the people who mutinied was that of Netaji. The stories of Rani Jhansi Regiment absolutely inspired and enchanted the country. Freedom of India came at midnight on 15th August. But the tricolor was still not fluttering on the Red Fort on that day. Delhi was the same place where a solar eclipse had told the world that the Mughal Sultanate is over, and so is the East India Company. India is going to be ruled directly by London and the Crown, and Queen Victoria would be Kaiser-e-Hind after 1857. On 16th August, Sardar Patel ensured that an event would take place at the Red Fort. The day before that, the Indian national flag was actually unfurled by Pandit Nehru at India Gate. And suddenly in the skies of India, especially Delhi, right over the India Gate, but the statue of Netaji is now going to be placed as it should have many decades ago. A rainbow appeared. The citizens of Delhi still wanted the tricolor on the Red Fort. The next morning, 500,000 people, the entire population of the city, reached the Red Fort early morning to see the changing of the flag. As the Red Fort was crowded with miles and miles of people, Netaji's Azad Fauj, led by Colonel Shahnawaz Khan, sang the national anthem and did their parade. Once the tricolor fluttered on the Red Fort, the true liberator of India, the mantle of the true liberator of India fell on Netaji. He had not only ended the British Raj or the British Empire in India, he had actually dismantled the British Empire all over the world. His strategy worked. He found the answer. 75 years later, after the transfer of power in 1947, we are celebrating our freedom this year all across the country. This is that time when every Indian needs to be told the story of our great Netaji, the true liberator of India, and the actual superstar of our freedom movement. Thank you very much. Jai Hind. It's been great fun talking about Netaji.
Sir, as you mentioned about Veer Savarkar ji, initially in your talk that he wrote the book on 1857, and he very clearly mentioned that we need to create an armed struggle in order to oust the British. But we see that post-independence, there was an idea floated that independence was sought through the movements of Congress and majorly under the leadership of Mahatma Gandhi. But very recently, more and more documents are coming into light. And also, very important to note that as we commemorate birth anniversary of Baba Saheb Ambedkar today, in an interview to BBC, he also said that he believes that independence happened due to Bose. So on that note, I would like to know and understand from you, was there a systematic approach behind this negation of truth and trying to propagate a false narrative in the first place? And secondly, if there has been this has been the case, then what needs to be done today as we are coming to terms with the fact?
We have to understand very clearly the efforts of Mahatma Gandhi, the civil disobedience movement, and the sort of Dandi marches, as well as the other strategies employed, they failed. They failed miserably. He couldn't solve this problem. It was way beyond him. If at all it did anything, it delayed the process and complicated matters unnecessarily. The solution that Netaji proposed, the solution that has been understood by Savarkar and Hardayal before him, was the same. And after independence, forget what the historians have written. The Republic of India has not followed at any stage the Gandhian strategy for defending its territory. If somebody attacks this country, our army responds just like Netaji would have wanted. We do not do any fasting. We do not do any marches for, our freedom. The case of the last colonial power within India, Goa, should be studied. We sent the army. In fact, we sent Brigadier Sagat Singh. He would make a terrific hero in a movie. Very unusual man. He not only liberated Goa, he fought against the Chinese in 1967, and eventually he was the reason we won in 1971 in Dhaka. So that has been the official strategy. Now, our historians have done great disservice to this country. They have, some of them, have actually just duplicated the British viewpoint and told us the story of Mahatma Gandhi as the only story. The multi-layered story of the Indian freedom movement gets lost. Till today, most people don't know who Hardayal was. And even now, after 75 years of independence, people are still living under some wrong impression that Netaji was immaterial, irrelevant. The key persons were the leaders of the Congress party. Nothing could be further from the truth. In my book, I have documented specifically, and now I'm writing my fourth book, again documenting specifically what the British thought of Netaji and what were the turning points as far their governance of India was concerned. They had absolutely no fear from the Congress party. It was very easy to deal with. And they were under no moral pressure to vacate India under any circumstances. In fact, if Netaji and Azad Hind Fauj were not there, just remove them from the Indian freedom struggle completely, India would not have been free even till today. Why? Why would they leave the jewel of the crown? They had so much to gain. Indians fought for their freedom in the Second and the First World War. What else do you want? So, time has come for universities like yours, Indus University, other universities, to revise the history from the Indian perspective, to simply state the facts. I don't negate the efforts of others, put them out also. And when you study in a multidisciplinary university like yours, across various courses, the efforts of each and every individual, you will realize it was the revolutionaries and the Azad Hind Fauj combined with the efforts of 1857 and the Ghadar party that eventually knocked the British out of India. Baba Sahib Ambedkar's interview with the BBC is recorded in my book on Netaji. In 1954-55, he gave that interview. He actually was attending the INA trial. He was a lawyer. He sat in the gallery. He saw the trial. He knew the truth. Anybody who lived in that period knew the truth. For political reasons, for extending political careers, the truth was hidden away. But not any longer. I must also tell you, the story of Netaji's appearance, disappearance, and whatever nonsense they have put out there since the Second World War was also a strategy to mislead us, to confuse us, to waste our time. The superstar of Indian freedom movement was the most extraordinary man born in India. Whatever we do today, we should thank him. Imagine what he accomplished, traveling through the jungles of Burma with a price on his head. While researching the book on Netaji and now trying to make a movie on Netaji. I have met people who lived in that period. 90-year-old people. They would get roused by just the mention of his name. Lord Acklenneck has actually stated that Netaji was a very strong personality. He had a huge impact on individuals who came across his life. The other leaders didn't. They didn't matter. In fact, they saw him as a huge rival, a younger person, more brilliant in studies than him, better speaker. Netaji's facility with Hindustani was better than any other Indian leader. So I hope that answers your question. I get emotional, when you talk about such subjects, because I have studied the same books which you have studied in school, and they are inconsequential. I must tell you one more thing. My son was studying in Delhi school, one of the finest schools in Delhi, and he asked me about the freedom struggle because he had a test, and I told him the story of the freedom struggle as I saw it, as my father saw it, who actually participated in it. And next day, my son came and he shouted at me. He said, "Whatever you told me, I wrote in the test, and I got a 0." In fact, the teacher said, "What is all this about Netaji? Haven't you read the book?" I said, "Please bring your class book." And they brought the NCERT book, and my son's book class had studied from that book. They had most of the book was about the Congress Party and its effort in the freedom movement. There's one paragraph, small paragraph with a picture of Netaji. That's it. So if you tell your school kids about one aspect of the Indian freedom movement, you're doing a great disservice to the country. Nobody does that. This needs to be revised now. And I believe it is being.
Yeah. And also, as you mentioned about the books and also about rewriting, I was going through one of your panel discussions of one of the leading news channels in this country, and where you said that the history writing, rewriting has to be done by the people of India. So basically, what do you mean when you say that? Because it's a very important statement to make. And also, how do you view it? How do you envisage how it will be done, and what is the future, and how far we have actually achieved, in your opinion, as far as history rewriting is concerned?
Yes, is famously known, history is written by the winners. So we were given a versioning of our own country's story by British historians because they were ruling us in English language. And our universities, teachers, and their students followed the same. There was no work done, and there was political complexity to it because the powers that were deciding the course of events in India and our future studies, they had vested interest in it. They did not want the true story of the Indian freedom movement to be put out there because it would lead to losses in elections straight away. That because once you read the story of Netaji, you suddenly realize here is a giant among other people. So just keep him out of the picture. That's the best part. So I feel a time has come, and 75 years is a very long time, that we, the people of India, need to ignore the history books written by the British authors and the court historians. There are thousands of them, and start reading about the stories of India. I'm doing this. Lala Hardayal was the finest student produced by St. Stephen's College. The kids over there last week told me they had never heard his name. I went to lecture there and they said, even now, 2022, all they hear is about Mahatma Gandhi. Nothing wrong in that, but please tell the people there were others, possibly far more important than Mahatma Gandhi in the scheme of things and in decision making. So we are going through that process. Every nation does that. And as nations become richer, history becomes more and more important. Our museums, our schools, our universities will soon realize that this aspect of our freedom struggle has been ignored. And I think the government today, more than ever before, is on the same page as us. The efforts of the current government are in the right direction. And the inspirational stories, so many soldiers of Azad Hind Fauj are revolutionaries. They will light up the skies of this country forever. Imagine 200 years from now, when none of them us are here, people will still know the story of Netaji. People will still know the women warriors of Azad Hind Fauj, the Rani Jhansi Raja. Very important for a nation.
And I think collective efforts like such in the books you have been writing, and I think these things would make it possible for us to rewrite the history at some point in time. Till then, your books and similar books and such sessions would be a gateway for students who would like to know the other side of the story.
Yes, I agree. I think we should give an opportunity to Mr. Surya Bose, Madhuri ji, and Ardundu Bose to also speak. They are part of this small discussion.
Yes, well, Bhuvan, it was interesting. Yes, I've heard you quite often. We've spoken also, but I think it was good what you covered for the university students, definitely, and for a lot of the others. And I just reminded a friend of mine from Vienna, Herta Kashid, she's also listening in. We organized the first international seminar on the Indian freedom struggle with Tilak, Gandhi, and Bose in Vienna in 1978, and Herta was very much part of it. So we started very early, and it's important that we really, the university, the schools in India should be taught the proper history of India's freedom struggle, which has been lacking badly. And there are efforts, but it's a long way to go. But I don't want to start a lecture here, but any questions from the audience, I'm willing to take.
I think I can ask a question to you, sir. As Dr. Lall was mentioning about the revolutionary activities across the country, and as well as things that were happening outside India. And he also mentioned that Netaji read about revolutionary movements, and he understood one thing, that freedom would only come through armed resistance. And he could sense that the Second World War was approaching, and they already began to plan the second run of the Gadar movement. But when we read the history, we generally get a view that things were happening in isolation in India, and the entire freedom movement was concerned with only the 3 to 4 major movements of the Congress party, and we had nothing to do with the things that were happening outside. But the fact remains that the international situations, they greatly impacted our independence movement, and that was the thing that INA took benefit of, and they finally leveraged the situations the world wars presented. So I would like to understand from you on this and hear your view.
That's a very, very long question. I mean, that'll take another hour or so. I don't know whether it would make sense to cover it here. I mean, we must have a separate session on that. But yes, I mean, during in the 1930s, when he was allowed to go out of India for health reasons, he studied the history of the European countries and how they had got their independence, what they I mean, how they were running their countries, because he got a lot of ideas of when he set up his provisional government of Azad Hind in Singapore, in Southeast Asia. It was a very democratic setup with all military personnel. But there were some civilians, but it was very well structured. It was not a one-man show. He was the supreme commander, but it was very democratic the way he set it up. And the thing is, I mean, I've met quite a few Japanese who were part of his movement in Southeast Asia. I met them in Japan, I mean, in their 90s. and they talk highly about him. He said the Japanese never expected that such a person, I mean, from India especially, they had heard of all our Indian, the non-violent movements and things, that Subhas Chandra Bose, when he met Tojo, Bhuvan has mentioned, it took quite a few weeks before he could meet Tojo. And you see, there was the head of the Black Dragon Society, Mitsuru Toyama, who sort of pressurized Tojo to meet Subhash as soon as possible, and that's how he did. And Tojo became a great admirer of Subhash Chandra Bose overnight. He told his wife that, now I have met my leader, because this was told by his wife, or let's say widow, when after Tojo was executed after the Tokyo trials. The wife, the widow of Tojo, mentioned this to Dr. Radha Vinod Pal. When Dr. Radha Vinod Pal met her, he said, my husband had said he has met his leader. I mean, in Subhash Chandra Bose, can you imagine the Prime Minister of Japan considering Subhash Chandra Bose as his leader? So there are a lot of things one can talk about his personality and the influence he, sort of had over not only the Indians, all the Southeast Asians, because when the foreign minister of Japan, Shigeru Mamoru Shigemitsu, had said, he's the hero of Asia. He is not only fighting for the freedom of his own motherland, he's inspiring the whole of Southeast Asia to fight for their freedom. Because when they retreated from Burma, he told Aung San that if it was necessary, he should fight the Japanese for their freedom. So it doesn't really matter who you're going to fight. I mean, because I'm collaborating with the Japanese, you don't have to. If for your freedom, if you have got to fight them, then fight them. So that's how, I mean, most of these Southeast Asian countries also got independence from British imperialism after the Second World War. I'll just tell you one anecdote which may be of interest, because something quite different. A Japanese, the name of Yamamoto, I interviewed him in 2013. He was then 94, and he passed away a few years back. And he mentioned during the retreat, it was somewhere in Thailand, the Yamamoto was present when the officers, soldiers, even the Rani of Jhansi regiment, they were all retreating. And it was raining, it was in the evening, a big limousine came by and it got stuck in the swamp. So nobody got out of the limousine. They waited, and there were a lot of soldiers and others around who came and pushed the car out of the swamp. It was Barmon and Lady Barmon of Burma. They were in the car. Half an hour later, another similar limousine came and got stuck at the same place. And then what happens? A person gets out of the car. It was Subhash Chandra Bose, and he started pushing the car. He said, there's the difference between the two people. He said, such a great personality, but he also, got down to help. So these are the differences in the human beings. Such great people, but they're great differences. So, you can ask my sister who's written a book about the Bose brothers. She's also present here.
Yes, it's always really inspiring listening to Dr. Lall. I can't see him anymore, but I'm sure he's there. Now, you mentioned the book on the Bose brothers, which was published in 2016. And I think I would love to share the ethical code which Subhash Chandra Bose wrote in Mandalay jail in 1926. This he said was going to be his first book. Not many know about this, so I'm sure that especially for the students listening in today, it'll be interesting for them to know what Subhas Chandra Bose thought of could be an ethical code for the future Indians, especially for the youth. So the very first point that he made, which would constitute an ethical code for Indians, is honor and self-respect above everything. Die if you cannot live with honor and with self-respect. The second point is, while enriching your life to the fullest extent, be prepared to give it up at a moment's notice. I think he lived this principle in his own life. I mean, he had no fear, as you know.
And here I would like to understand from all of you, if you can comment briefly about the INA trials. As Dr. Lall already mentioned, that it was already thought by revolutionaries much before Netaji that something of this sort has to be done, and a kind of rebellion in the army has to be initiated. So can we say to some extent that the 1946 revolt was 1857 recreated, but this time a success?
Absolutely. 100%. We fought three wars of independence. 1857, the Ghadar Party and the Azad Hind Fauj. This is how we got our independence. This is the story. This is the main story. There is another story which everybody knows, but that's plot B. This is the main plot. Most interesting, exciting story of our country.
In fact, I must say this, that whenever Bhuvan speaks, he makes sure that he gets inside your heart. So that's fantastic. I enjoyed listening. And remember, we have had numerous programs over here in UK where Bhuvan has addressed numerous people. And every single time we've had some fantastic response. Now, one of the things that I have found in recent months, especially promoting the great work of Netaji, is that the young people have no idea of who he was. Even now, they don't know who he is. They don't know what part he played in the independence movement. And similarly, the other freedom fighters that Dr. Lall has mentioned, they have no idea. They don't even they cannot even mention their names because they don't know. Of course, this is all to do with the history that has been taught. I myself have studied in India, and the history that I was taught, nothing of the sort what I'm learning today. It's completely different, and it was just, let's call it total whitewash of the reality of the British control of India. Prior to that, the Mughal control of India, how the Indians were actually treated under both these regimes. And it's very enlightening today that, we have people like Dr. Lall, who are ensuring that the history is going to be rewritten or is being rewritten. And for universities, it is very important to have these kind of seminars, and hopefully with large audiences of the young people listening to what their forefathers had to go through. And this is something that I feel is lacking. But one of the best things that has ever happened, if you remember when our Prime Minister Modi unveiled the hologram statue on Rajpath, the best thing that has ever happened for Netaji, best, nothing could have put him on the world map. That particular moment sticks in your heart like an arrow that has gone straight through. It's absolutely fantastic. So I'm very positive that the new generation, the younger generation, as they learn about our history, will understand what happened to their parents, to their grandparents and their great-grandparents, and what they are enjoying today. I think this is quite important. And Dr. Lall, hats off to you. Every time I listen to you about Subhas Chandra Bose, I learn something different. It's new, even though the incidences may be the same that you're narrating, but in a different way. Thank you very much. Thank you.
I may have mentioned this, Bhuvan, earlier. I don't know, because you talked about BBC recording of interview of Ambedkar, where he also mentions it was Subhas Bose, and Attlee had been to India. But this was my father, Amirnath, was, and he had an appointment with Lord Mountbatten in London on the 12th of November, 1976. And I was the chauffeur, so I had to tag along, and so I was there. We had tea in his Kennington Street residence in London. And so they were talking about a lot of things, and my father actually picked up something which my grandfather Sharad Bose had initiated, Union of Southeast Asian countries, together. To work together like the European Union. And Mountbatten was very interested to work with my father on those lines, so that the countries of the subcontinent could, work together and not at each other. So during the end of our the meet, my father asked him, he said, well, you had won the war. What was the hurry in your leaving India in 1947? So he looked at my father, he smiled, and then he said, you of all persons shouldn't be asking me that question. Your uncle made it impossible for us to stay in India anymore. So we have, at least the Brits are honest enough to admit if something really,
I think, Surya, you should put this on paper and put it out there so that it can be taken out as a viral thing across the world. This incident carries a lot of weight, because Mountbatten was the man who was involved in transfer of power, as we know. And if he's saying that, it will add to the legacy of Netaji.
Yeah.
So as Pravin Patel ji mentioned about the Netaji statue at Rajpath, I would quote a Foreign Minister S. Jaishankar. He tweeted the same day that the presence of Netaji Subhas Chandra Bose at India Gate is a long-awaited correction of history. And he also said that this is a message from New India, and we will be true to ourselves when dealing with the world. So do you see this as a defining moment for the country? Because it's not just about the granite statue, it's also much to do with the location of Rajput, the significance associated with that place, and choosing Netaji for that canopy. What message it gives?
I have been a supporter of this. In fact, Madhuriji will remember when we did that event in Delhi, this was the rallying point for all the speakers about 2-3 years ago, that we should place the statue of Netaji right on Rajpath. The mindset shift is happening in India. And we have lived with the non-violence, civil disobedience mindset for 75 years, which was nonsense. And now we need to get real. And for India to emerge as a global power, Netaji is going to be our guiding force. He was a global leader. He was the man, actually the only person to have met all the three leaders of the Axis power. He was a person who was most respected in India. And even now, 75 years later, rarely do I read anybody speaking anything negative about Netaji. So every other leader has been, sort of abused. But nobody says anything against Netaji. People think his sacrifice is unparalleled. So as the country moves towards its 100 years of independence, this generation, next 25 years is very important. And we are lucky to have a leader who thinks Netaji will be our guiding light, because he was the man who led us to freedom. Now he will, in this situation, lead us to a Vishguru situation. And with each passing day, the importance of India is increasing. So I think it's a mindset shift, and it's very important to have Netaji at this stage. He is a person who every Indian should aspire to become. I will just like to thank all of you for staying around till the end.